Hi, I'm with Worley. This is my life, I take it. I was born February 13th, 1942 at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, which, as you all know, is about 2 miles from here, so I haven't gotten far. And I had two older brothers, but they both died in infancy. One was born in 36, I believe, and one in 38, something like that. And because of these crib deaths, and who knows why, but because they both died in the cribs, they decided when I was born that they weren't going to lay me down. And so all the aunts and uncles and everybody in the family rallied around, and they took turns staying up with me. And I slept on somebody's shoulder for the first 6 weeks of my life. Never made it to a crib. And when I tell that story, a lot of my friends say, that explains a lot. but that is a true story. When the Second War broke out, I was born 3 months after Pearl Harbor. At that time, my dad was 34, too old to be in the Army. But everyone in the United States pitched in. This is something just foreign to us now. Everybody did something. And they took over the General Motors plants. And my dad by that time had become a foreman. But when the war broke out, General Motors, all their plants were converted to making stuff for the war. And they were building bombers. And Dad went to Berea, Ohio, which is outside of Cleveland. And I have a bunch of pictures of me from age 2 to age 4 living there until the war was over. And when the war was over, in 1946, I came back to Kansas City, and Dad had saved up enough money that he bought the house at 8307 Blue Ridge for $6,000 something, paid cash, and went on his whole life paying cash for everything he bought. He died at age 76 in 1986, having never had a credit card and having paid cash for everything he bought. If you didn't have the cash, you didn't need it. When he was 70, he could still pull a tree trunk up by its roots. I had no preconceived notion when I was young of doing anything other than getting a job, and I was very responsible because I was an only child, and my mother had been sick, and so I was pretty much a kid that did. I was kind of dull and boring compared to my children. I pretty much did what I was supposed to do, and there was no money. Prior to, I guess, the 50s probably, following the Depression, there just was, during the early years of my life, you just did not have the money that even poor people have nowadays. And my dad was from the old school. He did everything himself, and from the time I was 12 on, I had my .22 rifle leaned against the back door, and whenever I'd go outside, I'd take my rifle with me, and in case a rabbit hopped up or something. And it was a totally different kind of life. I was 10, and one of my neighbor boys got a new bicycle, and so I expressed my need for a new bicycle to my dad. And he said, well, you need to earn the money. I said, well, how am I, And he had an idea. He said that he saw at the feed store that if you bought 100 pounds of feed, they were giving away 50 free chicks, 2-day-old chicks. And the feed store, the building is still there now. It's on 85th Street between Prospect and 71 Highway. So we went over, and he loaned me the money to buy my chicken feed, and we got 50 chicks. We put them in our basement under a lamp, which was a light bulb hanging down for warmth. And so, I don't remember, 2 or 3 of them died, but we got them up and we raised them, and then we put them out in the chicken pen afterwards. You take a chicken, you lay his head down, you lay a broom handle over his head, you stand on either side of the broom handle and you pull. His head stays on the ground and you hold the chicken. Then your mother is boiling water And so you take the chicken up by his feet and you swish him around in the boiling water, and then they pick off the feathers, and then they remove the intestines and what have you, and it's called dressing the chicken. So my mother would dress the chicken, and every time that she would dress a chicken, I would be required to wash the dishes. One dish wash for one chicken dress. And so then we sold the chickens for $1 a piece to people at church. Fresh chickens, fresh dressed chicken for $1 a piece. And I got my $40 or $45, whatever it was, and I paid my $5 or $10 feed bill, and I took the rest of the money and bought my first bicycle. You know, I know I'm unusual. I mean, I know that, but I think everybody thinks of themselves as unique, and I always, when people ask me what I am, I describe myself as an unemployed veterinarian from Raytown, and I've been doing that old tire joke for a lot of years. I'm obviously an entrepreneur. I was an entrepreneur before it was called entrepreneur. When I started out, not having a job and doing something that was, you know, you were kind of a hustler. You were not a, you know, it wasn't really real people went and got a job for some big company and they had a guaranteed check every Friday, and being an entrepreneur is much more risky, and as Libby can tell you, it requires a wife that can live with not knowing where your next meal's coming from at times, and not knowing if you're rich or poor, depending on how the next deal is, and it's not always easy, and to have someone like me is difficult for a wife to deal with the uncertainty of the entrepreneurism, because as long as you're really an entrepreneur, as long as you're doing the size of deals that I did, the risk of going broke is always there. When you sign the paper, you're risking it all. And now when you finally get enough, that's not true. At some point in time, you can exclude things, and it gets a lot more comfortable. But when Libby and I were really starting to roll, you risk it every time, and not every woman can live with that. My mentor on that was my uncle Ira Odsley. We called him Chief, and he was a 8th grade educated horse trader, married to my mother's oldest sister. And after my mother died, I kind of started just hanging out with him because they never had any children. He'd pay me 50 cents an hour to hoe cockleburrs out of the cornfield, but he would, and he was a much less warm and caring guy. My dad was a very loving, warm and caring. Uncle Ira was much more pile driving, hard, you know, and he came up with some of the great lines that my children have heard their whole life, like he'd tell me to go wash his car, shine his shoes or whatever, and he said if I did that myself, it'd be like having a dog and doing your own barking, which I've told the kids forever. Uncle Ira was from DeWitt, Missouri, D-E-W-I-T-T. Doesn't exist anymore, I don't believe, down by Carrollton, Missouri, in Carroll County. He gave me the opportunity. He owned a grocery store, and that was a job. He put me to work in the grocery store when I was 15 or 16, and he would just give me all these little hints. He had me loaning money to the other checkout boys and stuff, you know, because I was always very careful with money, and you know, he taught me about charging interest and giving the guys $4 and getting $5 back on payday. And he was the one that turned me on to the fireworks business. And an interesting sidelight was about 10, 15 years ago, I got a call from a guy, Autry Smith was his name. he called me and said, Doc, I've been keeping up with your career. He said, I'm Arthur Smith. I just got named to the federal bench here. I've been a lawyer down in Nevada or somewhere. He said, I'm going to be on the federal bench here in Kansas City. And so I knew I was going to be running into you sooner or later. I just wanted to call and remind you of who I was, because I'm sure you don't know. I was a little cousin of so-and-so that was my fraternity brother. He said, you gave me my first job. I worked in your fireworks tent. And Arthur Smith is now the presiding judge of the federal court here. And he called and said, you gave me my first job working in your fireworks tent over on City One Highway. And I just wanted to call and reintroduce myself. At the end of that time, I made $10,000. I bought a brand new '63 Volkswagen Beetle when they came out. And I saved the rest of the money to help me get through school. So those were and my uncle was so proud of me. I can remember I'd look somewhere and he'd be kind of hiding around the corner of a building watching me, and he was just, running those 2 fireworks deals were a really big deal to him. And I'm a veterinarian because of him. He had one of his best friends was a guy named I.J. Tweehouse that was a veterinarian. And one time he just said, hey, you're pretty good with animals, and the guy I know's got the best deal anybody is my buddy Tweehouse. I think I'll be a veterinarian. I said, okay, I'll be a veterinarian. I knew nothing. Uncle Ira, Chief Osley said, be a veterinarian. I said, okay, I'm a veterinarian. So that's how that decision was made. It was the middle of the Vietnam War. This history plays in things that you can't control. I mean, if you read much religious material, that's the key, is acknowledging you're not in control, God's in control, somebody else in control. Things that happen to you or don't happen to you define your life. And at that time, a lot of my classmates joined the public health service or were drafted. And so there was a thing called the doctor's draft that was the veterinarians, dentists, and MDs. You received your deferment until you graduated. But in exchange for that, you remained 1A for the draft, top level draft guy, until you're 35 years old. I graduated as 24. So I had 11 years of exposure, and Davenport did too. So we made a deal. We went in together and started the first clinic in Lee Summit. We wanted to, we were entrepreneurs. We weren't going to work for anybody. So we started our first clinic. He joined the Air Force Reserves at Richards-Gebaur, and I did nothing. And the theory was, surely we wouldn't be so unlucky as they call up the reserves and draft me, which I don't know what the hell we'd have done then. We'd had a clinic with nobody, but we opened a clinic on June 1st of 1966 on 50 Highway in Lee Summit, and I had to hire a lady to come in and answer the phone while I left on June the 6th to go graduate. We took his salary that he was making. He went to work for another veterinarian. We took his salary plus whatever I could make running this one, because I'd had more experience and I looked older. And so I ran the clinic. He worked down, he'd come out, we'd do surgery at night, and we put all the money we made into a pot, split it 50-50, and then we took turns making the payment on the building, which was $333.08 a month. Remember that pretty clearly. We stayed partners we opened another clinic. We got prosperous and opened another clinic. We built the clinic. Uncle Ira died a week or two before I graduated. But I put a clinic where my fireworks tent had been. Built a little brick building. And Davenport and I owned that one together, and we ran the two up. It's called Crest Animal Hospital. I had bought a clinic on Mission Road in Fairway from another one of the 9 people who went through veterinary school together. And this fellow was George Gates, and he had a clinic in Corinth Square, and went down to Fairway, which was only 3 or 4 miles away, and put up another clinic. And then he just wasn't happy with trying to run both of them. And so he came to me and said, "You've got to take this thing over." And so I did, and I was actually working there. And there was a gal that was working there that something happened. She ended up having to leave, and so he sent me down another girl named Libby. And Libby was a school teacher who was an animal. I mean, Libby is, any of you that you all know, Libby is an animal person, and she is a dog whisperer as well as a horse whisperer and everything else. And so she came down, and she was by far the best help I'd ever had. She was a terrific veterinary assistant. But this time I was used to being the boss. I'd been out of school for several years, and I used to be the boss. And I think shortly after she arrived, I said, "Give me a Diet Coke," and she said, "Get your own Diet Coke." So it has been like that ever since. Got married in 77, 87, 97, 35 years.
Wow.
We moved in here, we bought it in 82, and we moved in, Lexus is about that long. When you look back at what a blessing that you have 4 kids, all 4 are smart, all 4 got all 5 toes, all 4 are taxpayers. You know, I mean, it's just that's kind of the goal in life if you simplify it, is you're trying to raise taxpayers. You're trying to raise people that'll go out and be independent in the world. My dad set that example, I guess, for me. He never, Uncle Ira said go be a veterinarian, but my dad never made any suggestions. I mean, until Uncle Ira told me that I was going to be a rocket scientist, because it was right after Sputnik, and the Russians were beating us, and everybody with more than a room temperature IQ was going to go be a rocket scientist at that point in time in history. And that would have been terrible for me. It's not what I'm good at. It's not anything. But my dad did not care. He just did not want me working for General Motors. He didn't want me to have to, he had to be down there at a certain time. He had to stay at a certain, he wanted me to have more freedom in my life. And I was going to go to college, period, in the subject. There was never a question. I was going. And for my children, I mean, that was, not going to college was not an option. I never even thought of that. Some of them chose college based on climate. Others based on academics. We've been blessed with what we've been able to, with what we've been given. You get busy with life, and your prioritization falls by the wayside frequently. But I can tell you what you should prioritize, and certainly family, religion, and work are the really, at least for me, have been the foundation and the things that I pay the most attention to. And in varying order, sometimes religion has been the most important, and other times work's been most important, other times the family. It comes and goes depending on what sort of hand of cards you're drawing at that moment on those days. There are times when you only have time to deal with the family, and there are times when you're able to only deal with work, and times that you need to deal with religion predominantly. The friends and family, work and religion are pretty much what I do. My belief is that there are a large number, as in maybe not half, but 30%, 40% of the people in the country are doing something they shouldn't be doing. They're plumbers that wish they were painters, they're doctors that wish they were lawyers, or whatever. They're just not doing the job that they're really meant to be. And I think that God gives each of us specific talents, and we don't all get the same talent. And your job is to kind of figure out what that talent is, and then try to do it well. And until you do that, till you figure out what that talent is and what it is that you really are going to enjoy, you won't get the full benefit of life. And I don't have a secret for determining what the talent is, but I think that is the thing, that if you can, number one, if you're trying to be happy in life, find that talent. That if it's not what you're doing now, quit the damn job and go get one that is what it is, and don't worry about the money, because if what you're doing you're really good at, you're going to make the money. So find what it is you want to be and be it. Chase that dream. That's number one. And number two, take your time and be good at it. There's nobody that starts a business or, starts taking care of their aging father. Anybody knows that aging father? Start any of these kind of things that they learn to be good at in a week. And so take it a bite at a time. It may take 5 years to get where you want to go with this job or with this relationship, or whatever it is you're working on, but work on it. Once you're sure that's the right thing. And only you can know that. And then lastly, and most important thing, in my view, as to being happy in life, is to develop the attitude of gratitude. Being gratefulness is gratitude itself is the most elegant of the human emotions. There's almost no drawback to it. Nobody has ever said to anybody, boy, I wish you weren't so grateful. And if you can be grateful to God, be grateful to your spouse, be grateful to your parents, be grateful to your children, be grateful to the guys giving you a job, whatever it is. But if you can wake up in the morning saying, I could have been born in Somalia. I could have been born not good looking. I could have been born dumb. I could have been born a whole lot of things that I'm not. And I'd just be grateful for what you have, and don't be a whiner. Be grateful and say, well, that's great, this is what I got, that's what I'm going to do, and everything will be fine. So those are the three little deals that are easy to do, or hard to do, but easy to talk about, and I know are accurate. Find out what you want to do and do it. Take all the time it takes to really get good at what you're doing. Because if you're good at it, you'll always make plenty of money and you'll always be happy. And 3, be grateful for everything you get. Don't whine. What I look for in people, now that I particularly admire, are people who figure out a way to do well while they're doing good. Quiet, entrepreneurial philanthropy. And all these checks and balances, while they're very irritating to those of us that have strong opinions and think we know how to fix everything. But the thought that maybe we don't occasionally creeps into our mind. And the fact we have to listen to the other people is a terribly important advantage. Fight the isolation tendency. We've been blessed with all these things, and biblically said, to those to whom much is given, much will be required. And the great tendency when you don't have enough money to do what you want to do is to pull back and become isolated. I'm never going to give another, I don't think we should ever send another nickel to Squat Morristown or wherever it is, or, we have to fight that tendency to do that, and we have to help where we can, just like the people have to help. And whatever problems present themselves, they're all within our ability to fix if we just get to fix them. And stop talking and get to fixing. There's 2 or 3 of my things that children would know that I left out if I had, and that's always right about my comments. Number 1, nothing good happens after midnight. It never has when they were 15. It ain't going to now. Nothing good happens after midnight. Get home and get in bed. All be well. Don't place yourself in harm's way. If you know you're in a dangerous area, get out of there. I mean, it's a pretty simple kind of thing. And lastly, a man with a wife and 3 daughters doesn't ever need to make a decision. It's a wonderful blessing. You can just come home and all things will be decided for you. Evan, have I forgotten anything? Pretty much it?
Yeah.
The rest is history. My dad arrived in Kansas City after he graduated from high school in Joplin in 1929. He hitchhiked to Kansas City, and his first job he got with J.C. Nichols himself. At that time, J.C. Nichols, Jesse Clyde Nichols, was just starting his business. And my dad got a job digging the basement of the Brookside shops. On the very first day, he got to be foreman of the crew. Mr. Nichols made him foreman of the crew for 2 reasons. 1, he was the only person on the crew that could read and write, and therefore fill out the reports. 2, he was the only white guy. And this was 1929, and Missouri has always been a southern state, and that's just the way it was. His other source of income during that time was in Marlboro, which was a little village. They had Friday night fights in Marlboro, and they would box. And my dad boxed every Friday night. He got $5 for doing that. He lived in a boarding house, which was normally a large home where a widow or sometimes a family would take in men mainly. And during the Depression, there were a lot of men that were just traveling around looking for a place to work to send money home and keep everybody going. And he lived in a boarding house which provided him with a bed and 2 meals a day here in Kansas City. He met my mother and they were dating, and they didn't want to get married because he couldn't afford it. And General Motors decided to build a Leeds plant to build Chevrolets. It was called Fisher Body, was the name at the time. And Dad went to work there in mid-1934 when the plant opened. And my parents were married in October of 1934. And my mother's family had come in the mid-1800s, had taken a covered wagon from Wise County, Virginia, and came bringing slaves with them and homesteaded 640 acres. So they were 7th or 8th white family, meaning non-Indian in this case, in Jackson County. They built a church, Bosonia Baptist Church, at the corner of 95th and Blue Ridge, and 95th and Raytown Road, and they started the cemetery, all as a part of their arriving in the scene. And of course, people started dying pretty regularly, and they're all been buried in the cemetery ever since. They were more prosperous than the Worley family. The Worley family had been, both of my father's grandmothers were Indian, and both of those grandfathers were Scottish, and they had come from Scotland and married Indian women, and which made both of my grandparents, William Henry and Maud, were both a quarter Indian, one Cherokee and one Modoc, and which made my dad a quarter, which made me an eighth, which you all have the records of that. So they were, my grandfather was a bricklayer and hard scrabble farmer, and they were not particularly prosperous. My mother's people, Irvins, were, on the other hand, had done very well, and they had a dairy and had been active in the school system. And my grandfather and my uncle both were members of the Consolidated District Number 1, the Hickman Mills District school boards, and that's why there is an Irvin Junior High School still functioning in that district. And so I guess the Worleys have always had a history of the men marrying up, and it continues to this very day. And a lot of my memories of them center around the church. My mother had breast cancer when I was, I don't remember exactly, but 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that, and ended up dying in July of 1954 at age 44. I'm sure any psychologist would say that's some terrible thing. But I remember it, and I remember her in her wheelchair in the house. I remember one hot summer day that I was riding my bicycle over on Raytown Road and had a horrible crash and walked home with the skin off my forehead and off my knees, and my bike bent up to where it couldn't be ridden, and I came to the front door of our little house and banged on the door, and I remember my mother was sitting there in the wheelchair and got up and walked, took one look at me and got up and walked to the door. And those are, I have little snippets of memories, and I remember the day she died. My dad was always he wasn't quite as brash as I am, and he always was kinder and gentler, and he referred to people nobody was ever poor in my dad's mind. They were of lesser means. My dad was a hard worker. He's a wonderful father. Loved me to absolutely to death. Couldn't be, but he worked at General Motors, and he didn't particularly like it. And he wanted to make sure that I was going to go to college. He didn't care what I did, but I was going to go to college. And I still have upstairs above my dresser, a small cream jar. Milk used to come in glass bottles, and cream came in a very small glass bottle. And I have a cream jar from Berea, Ohio, where we lived during the war. And I would meet Dad at the door when he came home at night, and he'd put his loose change in my cream jar, and that was my college money. And then we took that and bought saving bonds with it. So at the end of by the time I went to college, we had several $1,000s saved up from the change Dad brought home every night and put it in a cream jar. He retired when he was 53 from General Motors on a special deal that they gave them. He had 2 years of sick leave built up because he'd never been sick, and he took that and then was able to retire legally at 55. And so he bought a farm because he always wanted to have a farm, and they moved down South Missouri. Going to college was never a question. Once Uncle Ira decided what I was going to be, then it was just a matter of where. Most of the Irvin family, on my dad's side, the Worley family, nobody had been to college. They were still Indians and working people. My mother's side of the family, most of my cousins, there were 12 cousins, and I think they all went to college. Just everybody went. I mean, 2 of them were engineers, and I mean, it was not an unusual thing. And my dad, it was a big proponent of education, and so because he didn't have any, I mean, because he had high school, he was pretty proud of having high school, and some of his brothers didn't get through high school. I mean, it was that way. So I went down and enrolled at Kansas State. I remember I was rushed, and I was a spike. I was going to pledge Pi Ka, at Kansas State. And in August, I mean, we were within weeks of leaving. Somebody said, you know, Missouri's got a pretty good veterinary school. You live in Missouri, you probably ought to go down and check that out with them. So my Aunt Florence had an old 53 Ford that she let me borrow all the time. I drove to Columbia. And I met a man named George Shelton. George Shelton was a professor in the biology, in the parasitology department, and a really good Christian guy. And he just took a liking to me. And he said, we can't have you going to Kansas. We got to find some way. Sounds good to me. He said, I think I can get you pretty much a ride. If you come in under agriculture, when you go into agriculture and you go into the small town boys, suddenly you're a rock star. He didn't call it that, but that was the implication. So I had the Kroger scholarship. I had kind of a collection of scholarships. And then I had the money that my dad had saved up, nickel and dime, dropping in my little bottle. And he hired me as a research assistant, which amounted to, I had to go out to this research farm and take blood out of sheep and feed these sheep and do all these things. He was working on his PhD, and his title of his thesis was the host-parasite relationship between Esophagostomum columbianum and the sheep. I worked on that and got paid by the university. He was a professor, so I got a check from the university once a month for that number of hours I put in bleeding the sheep and taking care of the sheep and what have you. And then I worked down there at a Holiday Inn, providing them with waiters for banquets. And we'd get the veterinary students who were all hard-working country boys, and to get them organized. And then, you know, you provide, if they need 10 guys, you provide that, and then you go. And so I worked as a waiter at the Holiday Inn there in Columbia. So when you added all that together, and then you throw in the fireworks money, college. Back to the property that I got from Mr. Collins, we had built the McDonald's, and we were getting ready to build the Wendy's, and we'd have to get a road back in there in order to access the back part of the property. And John Edwards was the city manager of Lee Summit, a really good friend of mine. And so we went up to get the zoning for it one evening for a city council meeting. And John said, you've got to have a name for that street. And I said, in there like Kansas City or something, it's Troost Avenue here, it's going to be Troost Avenue. I said, no, in developments like this, you name it yourself. And it was about a year after Libby and I had been married, and so I said, okay, let's just name it Libby Lane. And he said, fine with me. So we named it Libby Lane, and it's still Libby Lane. And it's been developed all around it now and everything, but Libby Lane is still, it's a public street and runs back in through this property that we developed. No, I don't regret anything, because you can't tell. One thing you have to remember is the great law of unintended consequences. I've had several things exceed my expectations. I thought I might lose $1 million, I've lost 2 or 3. But if I didn't do those, I don't know what those led me to that I did do. And if I wasn't doing those, I probably wouldn't have done the business journals either, which was the biggest thing that we did. I have been the victim of a number of very, very fortuitous things that happened to me that, through no fault of my own, I stumble into things that do okay. And I'm a victim of good fortune. The business journals, the idea was to publish a paper that was only about local business. At the time, this was 1981, we published the first business journal the same month Alexis was born, in August of '82. There There were only half a dozen business journals in the country at that time. A guy that worked for, this is how improbable this is, a guy that worked for the guy that owned 3 or 4 of these other business journals, a fellow named Don Keel, who had been an editor, had been in the news business his whole life, married, had a kid, and just announced he was gay, 40-year-old guy, came to Kansas City because he knew his boss was getting ready to come to at a St. Louis Business Journal, and he wanted to come to Kansas City. So Don jumped ship, came to Kansas City, went to see a lawyer named Harold Fritkin about who in Kansas City might be dim-witted enough to provide the money to do this. Harold said, try Mike and Doc. So they came out to see us. I listened for 15 or 20 minutes, and Mike never met a deal he didn't like, and I was used to killing deals that he'd said we were going to do, and so I listened for a few minutes, said that's nuts, and left. Later on that day, I think it was a Friday, Mike drove up with his Mercedes loaded down with newspapers. Drove around the back of my house, unloaded them onto the patio up on 829 Greenway Terrace, and said, I want you to sit here this weekend and read these damn things. We don't even know any of the people, and they're very interesting. It's twice as good as a Star. Read that stuff. I said, all right. So I read them. And he was right. It was interesting. I didn't know anybody in St. Louis. But it was really pretty interesting. I said, well, okay. So we talked about the next Monday, and we started the Business Journal that ended up being this huge deal. With the deal, I made a deal with Mike. We'd start it, but once we'd lost $500,000, we'd quit and go home. And we never got there. I mean, it took off. It just took off from a number of different standpoints. We talked to Frank Morgan about it, who was the predominant banker in town at the time, and he said, don't do that, you guys. Come on. Everybody, you've gotten away with a bunch, you've messed some things up, everybody thinks you're magic, don't even think about it. Everybody will know you when you blow this one. This is all public, they'll all be down on you, etc. And I said, yeah, see there, Mike? We kept going. Finally, Mike drug me into it, and it took off and did great. So then we said, gosh, what should we do next? And so, with no planning, somebody mentioned to us that Milwaukee was a mirror image of Kansas City. So, okay. So we went to Milwaukee and started another one. Bingo, it worked too. Then there was a guy whose name's escaping me now, but the name of the book was In Search of Excellence. It was the first big business seller. I mean, it was this guy who was walking on water, came to Kansas City, gave a speech on In Search of Excellence, and talked about how the center of the world was going to be in something they called the Silicon Valley. San Jose, California. Never heard of it. So we said, well, geez, it's going to be the center of the universe. Let's go there. So we went to San Jose and opened a third one. It's all our research. We'd kind of fly over somewhere and say, that looks pretty good. Let's do that one. So to make a long story short, we got 7 or 8 of them working. And we got a call from Scripps Howard, this huge conglomerate. They have, 100 TV stations, stuff, a bunch of newspapers. And they had 10 business journals, one in every big city. They had San Francisco, San Diego, Fort Worth, Dallas, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. They had all these cities. And the guy, Bill Burley, the CEO of Scripps Howard, came flying in to talk to us. I'm an unemployed veterinarian from Raytown. We're talking about business. And, this guy knows what he does. It's great. And they couldn't make money with him. And so we agreed, Mike and I each, by this time we'd taken the company public. So it was a public company called American City Business Journal. And that's how he knew how to find us. And Mike and I owned 20% apiece. Mike and his family, Libby and I and the kids, owned 20%. And Scripps Howard gave us his 10 papers in exchange for 20%. So now we had a company who's 20%, Mike 20%, Doc and family, 20% Scripps Howard, and 40% public. And we figured out really early on what was wrong with Scripps Howard. Now, this is just a little sideline. I hope people will think this is interesting. The day that we bought Scripps Howard, I was looking for a fellow named Jim Bergfalk that worked for us, and I called Houston. He was supposedly down in that office. And the girl answered the phone, American City Business Journal. And I said, what'd you say? She said, American City Business Journal. We used to be owned by Scripps Howard, but a company called out of Kansas City called American City Business Journal bought us today. I said, sweetheart, this is American City Business Journal calling you. And don't ever say that again. You're the Houston Business Journal. Anybody asks you who owned you, tell them it's some guy down at the bar. He's got cowboy boot. I mean, you're local. And what Scripps Howard was doing, if they found a good story that was interesting in San Francisco, they'd publish it in all 10. Well, they were competing with the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Kansas City Star. They were competing all these big guys. We didn't want to do that. Our motto was, if the president gets shot in your market, run your article about the undertaker that picked him up. People want to know about the local people. We don't want to compete with Wall Street. Those guys are smart. We want to write articles about the local people. And so we turned the Scripps Howard papers around by just saying, guys, just cut it out. Write about local people. And that's how we discovered it. So it was really interesting. Then we went on, when it was over, we had 18 that we started and 18 that we purchased. We had 36. And after that tax act that I talked about earlier passed, we also had a bazillion dollars worth of real estate that we lost 25% of the value of. And so in order to save ourselves, we sold the business journals in order to pay off all the other debts. But there was a time, there was a time when we had 978,000 shares apiece, and it was trading for $44. So if you want to do the math, it was, and that was when the kids all got, the most spoiled children got new BMWs when they turned 16. It was kind of a fun time. The Royals tickets are a much shorter story. When I was director of Midland Bank, they had tickets that I shared with Midland Bank. We then sold Midland Bank. It was myself and two other guys, and we were working on purchasing another bank called Westport Bank, and we got the guy that was head of Midland Bank that I'd previously shared tickets with to go in and run that bank while we were looking at it. And about the third day there, he called me and said, Doc, you got to take these tickets out. I think these are pretty good. And this was 23 or 4 years ago. And so Westport Bank had these tickets that were down, 8 rows from the dugout. And so we went, and they were great. And so then we made the executive decision that the bank was in too bad a shape to maintain those tickets, so we transferred them over to me. And so we've had the tickets ever since, and they've been they're a great family asset. They're a fabulous family asset. Everybody goes. It's one of the easy ways to get after you see your 15-year-old and you ask him how's he doing, how's his golf game out of school, you're out of things to talk about. But you can go to a baseball game and talk forever. And so all of us use them in one way, shape, or form, and I occasionally use them for work, but mostly they're just for the family. And we've had these 4 seats for 25 years. You saw the sign that said, the one that taught us the love of the game. Yeah, I mean, they all go, everybody. The girls, I went with one night with Ellie, and I think, Evan, you were with me. We stayed, it was raining, and an afternoon game, Ellie wouldn't leave. We were staying in the rain, it was 11:30 at night, and Ellie won the Hy-Vee fan of the game. They came and handed her all his prizes and everything.
Nice.
So, we have a good time with it. And Royals baseball is a big part of the family. It gives you a thing to do together. Where's my little picture? I want to show that. This gentleman's name is the Right Reverend Alpha Francis Muhammad, who died March 22nd of this year. He was 18 months older than I am. Jeff Black, who was rector of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, it was when I was 50 years old, called me. Well, he didn't call me, he put a little thing in the bulletin that he'd met Alpha Muhammad, and he'd invited him to Tanzania, and Jeff said, I need somebody to go with me and, obviously pay the bill. And so something just moved me, sitting reading that one night, and I called Jeff, who was a good friend, and said, hey, I'm your guy. And so we took off and went for a month and lived in Manyoni, Tanzania. At the time, it had no running water, no electricity, no paved roads. And this Bishop Alpha had left his parish in Arusha, which is a big town, and where he had a little rock church and everything was nice, and moved into the bush to spread the word. And he ended up establishing, when he died, 20 years after he moved in there, they had 81,000 Christians in that area that he had. And his title was Bishop of the Great Rift Valley. His previous title was Bishop of Kilimanjaro. I mean, aren't those great titles? I just love them. Anyway, but he was a huge factor in my life. After I came back from Tanzania, where I spent a month without running water, without a shower, without a flushing toilet, without, I never complained about another motel in my life. I never, it just changes your look on things. And the people there were perfectly happy. They're perfectly happy. And it was just fabulous. And you could see it was first century Christianity. Here we're very worried about if we're proselyting, if we're trying to get somebody to switch their religions, if we're doing all this stuff. And there, we borrowed an old Land Cruiser from a hospital in Kilimatindi, and we would ride in this. When we got to ride, we'd ride in this Land Cruiser. One of the few times in my life I lost weight, incidentally, walking from everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And we'd ride in this Land Cruiser, and David, the bishop's assistant who was driving, would stop and pick everybody up. They'd hang off the sides and do what, just fill them up. But the minute he got in the car, he started telling them about Jesus. He started putting the proselyting thing, you need to believe this, and that. And after I'd been there a week or so, and I could understand the Swahili that we were dealing with, I said, geez, Dave, that's, pretty bold. And he looked at me like I had lost my mind. And he said, you don't understand, this is not the United States. He said, we've been worshiping the tree god and the animus and all these weird gods, and nothing ever happened. When we worship Jesus and pray to Jesus, things happen. I don't want them to miss it. I don't want these people, I don't want to let them get out of the car without knowing about it, because they might never get a chance to know about it otherwise. And so it is pure. It sounds exactly like the book of Acts, where they talk about the first apostles going out and telling about Jesus and about the religion. And so it's first century Christianity at work over in Africa. And that's why it's done so well. The Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Roman Church, and the Anglican Church of England are all doing very, very well in Africa and running up the number of members. It's been a fabulous thing, and it for me, I have no trouble believing the fact that Jesus was born, Jesus died, Jesus saved us. That to me is very plain, and the things that people get hung up on is, but what about this? What about that? Where can God agree? When can you go? What about this? What about if someone dies before they've, all these questions that people bring up? It doesn't matter. You're not supposed to understand that. I guarantee you that God didn't intend for us to have some 196 denominations, whatever we currently have. It's the basic facts are the basic facts, and if you have enough time left over to worry about all these the details of whether, who was married to who and how it all worked, etc. You just have too much time to worry. You need to get a job, and so many people worry about so little of things. I had one time a bishop of Western Missouri was sent here, and we were in a meeting over at Mission Hills Country Club, and the subject came up of pet peeves. What was bothering you? And this one guy there was a big golfer, and he said, the thing that really upsets me, and he launched into how bad it was the fact that guys change their shoes in their car without coming into the locker room. It's just so gross. It's just so low class, etc. And I walked out with the bishop, and he said, I felt like telling that young man, you need to go at home and fall down on your knees and thank God that the worst thing you have to worry about is where somebody's changing his shoes. That's your big problem to deal with. So I'm the belief system that we have, the Christianity, and really it's a Judeo-Christian tradition. It's the monotheistic, one God. I mean, all the great religions, the Muslim, the Christianity, and Judaism, all are based on Abrahamic law. They all believe that Abraham was the founding father, and then they have split and differ over all these various details. And really, the important thing is there is one God. We know what to do. The Ten Commandments are there. It's not. There's very little to really disagree on. You can argue over all these things, but there's no reason for it, except the belief. Except most people don't get the blessings from religion because their arms are too full of things they're worrying about and things that don't mean anything. There's no place for God to drop the blessings. Their arms are full of all this other crap. And if they just relaxed and enjoyed what is given to you, God doesn't want you to be unhappy. God doesn't want you to be worried about all these things. If you just believe and try to do the best, it's very clear. The Bible is very clear on a lot of points. They're not suggestions; they're commandments. And if you do all those, and if you try to help people, you start out with love your neighbor as yourself. I.e., if you don't love yourself, you can't love your neighbor. Get on it. Let's love ourselves. Lord's Prayer, forgive me as I have forgiven them. If you don't forgive them, how can somebody else forgive you? You chew it up. There's just lots. It's a very simple thing. Religion is a very simple thing. We try to make very complex, and it's not. It's not. Just not. And the theologians are probably the ones that cause us the most trouble. They get in there and they make a living at thinking great thoughts. And the fact is that the Bible was written for first century Christians with no fancy education, and you don't have to do that. If you ever want to look up anything that's really easy to understand and written beautifully, go into all the C.S. Lewis's books. The one I always recommend is The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, which is his dream of what heaven and hell is actually like. It's really fascinating. Really fascinating. He doesn't hold it out to be true at all. He just says this is a thought, but it lays these thoughts out.